Hello, this is an introduction to the first section of my book Absolutization, which begins after the introduction with a section which is entitled Early Buddhism. So what I'm aiming to do here is just provide a way into it, to discuss some of the main ideas in that section. It's obviously not a substitute for reading the detail of what's in the book. So just a word first of all about the reason for choosing this section and its focus as the beginning of the book Absolutization, and also of the whole series on middle way philosophy. So it's basically a way in. We have to start somewhere. And I recognise that probably a majority, though not everybody, of people approaching this series will be doing so with some sort of interest, at least, if not background, in Buddhism. So it's providing a way in from that angle. And what I'm aiming to show is that there are some key insights in Buddhism, particularly early Buddhism, which can then be used, can be related to a whole lot of other approaches, particularly those in neuroscience and systems theory and psychology, and aspects of Western philosophy. So I'm hoping to show, particularly here, that we can find those insights quite readily in Buddhism and Buddhist practice, but that they need clarifying with reference to other approaches, and particularly that we can start off in our understanding of absolutization by looking at some Buddhist sources. Now, I'm particularly labelled the early Buddhism, mainly because that's how I primarily relate to Buddhism. So I find the Pali Canon, with its access to early Buddhist approaches, much more straightforward to engage with and much more insightful, I think, than any of the later forms of Buddhism. Obviously, you can find all sorts of stuff in later forms of Buddhism, particularly the Mahayana, but it's layered in, I would say, quite a lot of metaphysical distractions, quite a lot of authority issues, and a lot of symbology which may be inspiring but may also get in the way at times. So that's why I'm focusing on early Buddhism particularly, and the Pali Canon, and that seems to me to be sufficient as a source of inspiration for the core insights of Buddhism as they relate to absolutization and the middle way. Okay, so this section of the book has 4 chapters, and so the first one is about mental proliferation, the second is about craving and hatred and delusion, the third is about the absoluteness of negations, and the fourth is about excluding options. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of those, some of the key points I'm trying to put across in those chapters. So let's start with mental proliferation. So mental proliferation it's a translation of the word in the Pali Canon, which is in Pali is papancha. So it means getting caught up in obsessive states, basically repetitive cyclic states of mind. Another term for those repetitive states of mind is rumination. That's a term that's often used in psychology and psychotherapy for those sorts of states. They're often caught up in either craving or anxiety of some kind. So cycles of mental proliferation are created by craving or by hatred or anxiety, and the way in which they seem to operate is that they're creating a surge of energy to try and remove a blockage to something we want, to a goal that we have. We need that emergency mode. There's a reason why it's developed for us as human beings. We can deal with a sudden danger by mobilizing our resources, mobilizing our energy, or we can go for an opportunity by doing the same thing. But we get caught up excessively in that emergency mode at times when it's not actually helpful to us. In fact, in our contemporary lives, most of the situations we're in are not aided by that emergency mode. What that emergency mode involves is mobilizing all our resources, making a particular effort to overcome a particular blockage to our desires or our safety or whatever it is. Although that may work in some circumstances, most of the conditions we work with are complex these days, and they're also long term. So the difficulties we have tend to be longer term difficulties, ones that require us to work much more patiently and carefully with what it is we're dealing with, whether you're dealing with a relationship issue or business issue or a conceptual problem of some kind, whatever it is. It's not likely to be resolved just by that surge of energy to remove the blockage. So mental proliferation is the marker of that way of operating, and the way in which we get caught in it is indicative of our failure to adapt from that way of operating that was helpful to us or could be helpful to us in some circumstances. So we can encounter that particularly in the experience of meditation and of getting distracted in meditation. And I think anybody really who's tried meditation will have experienced this. So you want to meditate, you set out to do a particular practice, perhaps you sit down, you try and focus, you try and relax, but an insistent chain of thoughts and feelings comes up, and every time you try and go back to the focus of meditation, that chain of thought and feelings, that cycle, comes back again and again. Perhaps you're anxious about something that you're going to do tomorrow, or perhaps you're going over a conversation you had with somebody the previous day that was a bit conflictual, and you're thinking about what you ought to have said to them but you didn't, and so on. So we get caught up in these states, and that's the mental proliferation, which is also an experience of absolutization. So it's a good place to start in our understanding of absolutization, because mental proliferation is our immediate encounter with it, and if we do that in a context like meditation, then it's our immediate coming to awareness of absolutization in our own experience. So mental proliferation is noted in the early Buddhist texts and things, so you can read about that in the book. I won't go into that now, but you can also track that in systems theory in terms of reinforcing feedback loops, the ones that happen to be in our mind brains, and you can also see mental proliferation neuroscientifically in terms of deepening channels of and particularly in cycles that deepen as we get more into the habit of proliferating, running between our what's so-called reptilian brain, the amygdala and the striatum, which produce craving and anxiety, and our prefrontal cortex, which is dealing with our more immediate experience and particularly the flow of concepts and beliefs that we are subject to. So if we get caught up in that loop, then that's really what absolutization consists in. Okay, so that first chapter is introducing absolutization in that immediate form. The second chapter, which is about craving, hatred and delusion, is panning out a bit to take a wider view of what fuels that mental proliferation and what fuels absolutization. So there's a basic relationship at stake here between craving and hatred, which we might normally think of as kind of emotional states or motives, and delusion, which is about our beliefs or about what are often referred to as our cognitive states. So the interesting thing about early Buddhism is that it puts forward this relationship, interdependent relationship between craving and hatred on one hand, delusion on the other, and that is symbolically reflected in the depiction in the middle of the Wheel of Life. If you've seen pictures of the Wheel of Life, which have the three animals in the middle, which represent craving and hatred and delusion, all biting each other's tails. So that interdependence, which is noted in Buddhism, well, how do we understand that? I think what they are doing interdependently, specifically, is creating absolutization. But in order to understand how we do that, how they do that, we need to distinguish different forms of craving, particularly, or what craving means in relation to desire. First of all, if you think about the relationship between craving and hatred, that's pretty straightforward. So craving is blocked in some way, and if we're blocked in something we want, then we start to hate the thing that's blocking us. So if hatred is just frustrated craving, there's this direct relationship between these so-called positive, they're not positive in other ways, but so-called positive desire states and the negative desire state, which is hatred. And that's also closely related to anxiety, which is also trying to avoid something, and the proliferation of something coming up that we fear. So craving stroke hatred is on one side, it's on the emotive side of the scale, if you like, but the other side is the beliefs that we develop and the judgments we keep making, which are fueled by that craving or hatred. And the key relationship between those is absolutization. So when we are in a state of craving or hatred, we develop a totalizing belief about the things that we are craving or hating, a totalizing or absolutizing belief, where we tend to assume that we have the whole picture about them. So if you think back to when you've been in mentally proliferating state, when you've been in an obsessive state, then one of the features of that is that probably the people you're thinking about in this limited, one-dimensional way. So perhaps you're fantasizing about what your boss has done to you and the nasty things he said to you, and in doing that you're only looking at one aspect, your experience of your boss, and you're constructing the view of your boss as a hateful figure on the basis of that, and you're not considering any of the other more complex aspects of your boss, such as other parts of his personality or the conditions he has to work in wider business or whatever it is. So we construct a projected, limited, totalized view of what we crave or hate, and so that view feeds into our emotions about it, and our emotions feed into our view. Um, so that's the key relationship that feeds those three animals, and this all comes from Buddhism. It's noted in Buddhism, this relationship. But what isn't always clear in Buddhism, or at least is somewhat disputed or inconsistent in Buddhism, in my experience, is exactly what craving is and how we understand it. Because you can get some approaches that distinguish craving from ordinary desire, and there are other approaches that conflate the two and see craving and desire as the same thing. But if you see all desire as craving, that seems to be behind the rebirth view in Buddhism, which I think is a big distraction from the insights Buddhism has to offer us, really. To make sense of this, I think we can't possibly see all desire as craving. Not all desire is totalizing in this sense. We have all sorts of ordinary desires which are part of our embodied functioning as human beings, which aren't absolutizing. You want a drink of water, you're thirsty, you have a drink of water. Okay, that's it. Desire fulfilled. No obsession, no conceptual repetition. You just drink it. Some of our desires are perfectly straightforward like that, and would obviously imagine that a Buddha would desire a drink of water and just have a drink of water, and that's it. So we don't have to confuse desire as a whole, particularly the desire just to exist or to live, with craving. So instead, craving is identifiable by the absolutizing beliefs it is associated with. So I think the insights that Buddhism offers us about craving are all about that. They're not about desire in general, which is a basic feature of human embodiment. Okay, so that takes us on then to the third chapter in this section, which is about the absoluteness of negations. So now we're beginning to investigate more about what kinds of beliefs are the ones that tend to be absolutizing, the ones that lock us into those mentally proliferating cycles. And I think the key insight of the middle way, particularly that distinguishes the middle way approach from other approaches, is the recognition that negations are equally absolute to positive claims. So when particularly when you've got an absolute belief that takes a positive form, then its opposite, that merely says, no, that's not true, that's complete falsehood or whatever, that is an equally absolute view. So it's just as much caught up in that cycle, that craving and hatred cycle. And again, we can tell that really from the relationship between craving and hatred that we looked at in the previous chapter. So craving and hatred sort of depend on each other. If you desire a particular goal obsessively, then you're also going to be obsessed with the blockages and getting rid of the blockages that stop you from reaching that goal. And the absoluteness of negations is depicted, I think, in an inspiring way in the stories of the Buddha's early life in the Pali Canon, where the Buddha leaves the palace, goes forth, goes into the religious life in the forest, then also sees the limitations of what he's being taught and what his fellows do in the religious life in the forest, and then he goes on to find a different way, the middle way, which is neither accepts all the assumptions of the palace nor all the assumptions of the forest, but takes some of the best features of both and reframes those, and so that's the middle way. And the middle way particularly works on the basis of recognizing our embodiment and the conditions created by our embodiment, and working with those conditions. So the Buddha's early life reflects a two-stage critique. So the Buddha first of all has to recognize, okay, there's a problem with the palace, with this absolutized conventional life where everybody seems to know what their job is, and it's locked into this isolated framework, this relativist view of the world. But a lot of the same things can be said about the forest, even though in some ways the vision is bigger. It's trying to be absolute in its view. It's trying to be universal in its view of what's good for human beings, and indeed it draws on practical approaches in some ways, but those are also accompanied by absolute assumptions that are not helping us. So if we go through that two-stage critique, we will need to recognise that the absolutes that we need to avoid are both positive and negative. A negation, well, the word negation can be understood in two different ways. Yeah? So a negation can be an affirmation of the opposite of what you previously believed, or it can just be a failure to affirm, which is equally a failure to affirm the original belief, and indeed also a failure to affirm the opposite. And that's again the difference between agnosticism about a pair of absolute opposing beliefs, where you refuse to participate in the framework they've created between them. Agnosticism as opposed to just flipping between opposed absolute views. So in the case of the existence of God, which is where the term agnosticism comes from, it's the flip is obviously between theism and atheism. Atheism understood as denying the existence of God. So if people flip between those two positions, they're normally just not considering agnosticism as a serious third option. And that's the kind of pattern you get whenever the middle way is just not recognised or neglected, which is a lot of the time. I think it's important when we're dealing with the absoluteness of negations that we try to avoid getting hung up on specific metaphysical polarizations, specific formulations of what the positive view and negative view are, and we don't start thinking of the middle way as another metaphysical view which is in the middle. So for example, it's not just a question of beliefs of in existence or non-existence opposed to each other. It's not just any more than it's just about theism and atheism. It's a general process, or an application of a skill that we need to apply to judgment whenever we encounter a judgment that is tempted by opposing absolutes, whatever those opposing absolutes might be. Then we need to avoid the absolutes and we need to navigate between the two. So if we recognise that absolutization can be negative as well as positive, we're also implicitly recognising the middle way as a possibility, that we could avoid both the negatives and the positives. But there's always this magnetic pull that we're likely to experience back towards the absolute positive and the absolute negative, because those views are simpler, they're easier, and they're reinforced by groups who often incorporate them into their identity. So you get not only kind of what might be called cognitive economy, you're trying to save energy just by taking an easy, simple view. There's also social pressure towards it. So it takes quite a lot of courage and resourcefulness, I think, to try and find the middle way. But it's also crucial that we try to do so. And in order to do so, we have to recognise the absoluteness of negations as well as positives. So both the negative and the positive poles, when they're opposing each other, are interdependent, and in any given case they consist in like craving and anxiety, which are interdependent with each other. Anxiety about not fulfilling the craving, cravings will overcome the anxiety. They're constantly locked together, and we also shouldn't confuse those with merely logical positives and negatives. So a merely logical positive and negative is conventional and actually doesn't really matter which way round you phrase it. So you can easily turn a positive belief, one that's logically or conventionally positive, into a negative, and vice versa. So you can talk, for example, about achieving some particular goal, or you can talk about avoiding the failure, and that's just rephrasing the same thing negatively. So it's just an accident of how we choose to phrase things quite often, whether they're positive or negative, in a merely logical sense. But what absolutization tends to do is to assume that that's the whole story, and that it's a final and ultimate state of affairs, that merely logical accident of phrasing is how the universe works, and whether there's a metaphysical truth or an opposed metaphysical truth. Okay, and also, so we distinguish that sort of metaphysical opposition from merely logical opposition, which is conventional, interchangeable, and also we need to distinguish it, I think, from emotional positivity and emotional negativity, because what we often refer to as emotional positivity is actually a more open state in which we can get beyond absolutization. So positive emotion, as engaged with in meditation, can very much help us towards more integrative states, which help us to engage with the middle way. So there's a few distinctions to make. The terms positive and negative are a minefield. So we need to try and pick our way through those without getting too confused. Okay, and then that takes us on to the fourth chapter in this section. So the fourth chapter is about excluding options. This is very much an outcome of the positive and negative absolutes opposed to each other, creating a joint framing where they exclude alternatives. And it's an established fallacy. There's an established fallacy called excluding the options, which is quite similar also to false dichotomy. So where you're only confronted with two options, but actually there are more options. And the fallacy of excluding the options just tells you that there's only two options, and you're not allowed to consider any others. So famously, like George Bush saying, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." So you couldn't possibly question George Bush's policy without being on the side of the terrorists. So it's that exclusion of third options is basically how the absoluteness of negations and how absolutization tends to work. So the third options that are rejected lie beyond both our positive beliefs and the rejecting negation, the implicit negation of what we believe. And when these alternative options, when the third options are excluded, that means that we effectively repress them. We can't pay them attention, so that generally means that we ignore them, or if someone tries to bring them to our attention, then we dismiss them. So ignoring and dismissing are the keynotes very often of excluding options, and you find that all the time in, for example, political discussion, where third options to a binary are just dismissed or not even raised. So the middle way is the consideration of those excluded options. So we're questioning and avoiding the absolute binaries, and we're opening ourselves, not necessarily consciously, but in some way opening ourselves to further options. And so it's important to see it in those terms as a way of working, rather than as a right answer which somehow lies in the middle. So it's not another metaphysical truth that happens to be the middle way. It's a way of approaching judgment which questions the absolutizing of the binaries. Which is also why we shouldn't confuse the opposing beliefs with specific metaphysical beliefs, because there can be any absolute beliefs we encounter. So that's where I think the Buddhist analysis of the opposing beliefs that the middle way avoids, as eternalism and nihilism, that works in the Buddhist context, but it's confusing and misleading in the longer term, because it distracts us from the process of judgment in which we navigate between the absolutes, and instead sets us on the trail of trying to find the right middle view. We can't tell what the right middle view is until we get there in the specific circumstances we are in. Okay, so the process of restricting the options can also be seen as maintaining a biased tendency. So we can understand this in terms of bias. It substitutes quick and easy routes through our brains, through the all the associations we've made in our neural systems. It substitutes those for more complex and difficult ones. Economizes on energy. It reinforces the dominance of the left hemisphere, particularly the left prefrontal cortex of the brain, so it often involves a conceptual substitution for something that involves more complex experience. And it continues the reinforcing feedback loops of proliferation. So all of those can be involved in restricting the options, with excluding the middle, as it were. And that often also results in conflict. So we restrict the options to winning or losing. We perpetuate conflict by being unable to consider third options, being unable to consider alternatives beyond winning and losing in the frame we started with. So yes, sometimes the third option, sometimes the third way, sometimes the middle way is a compromise, but can't be defined in terms of compromise. That's important. It's not just a compromise. But when people exclude compromise as an option, then it's relevant. Restricting the options is also about not adapting to the circumstances, not adapting to the conditions around us, because the conditions keep changing. We need to open ourselves to adapt to new conditions. But if we continue to think in the same way, using the same dichotomies about the conditions around us, then we'll get stuck. So we can get stuck just like a panda that only eats bamboos. It can't adapt to new food sources. In the same way, we can get stuck in the sense of continuing with our sort of fundamentalist beliefs, even though the world is changing, and failing to understand what's going on. Restricting the options can also involve discontinuity. We can set up lines that for us are absolute lines, whether they're lines in space or in time, that line is another form really of the restriction to two options. So either you're on one side of the line or you're on the other side of the line. Either you cross the Rubicon or you stay on this side of the Rubicon, and you don't think about, oh well, we could go around it, we could fly, we could burrow under it, we could do all sorts of other things. And that's the danger, I think, with the metaphysical interpretation of the Buddhist beliefs about impermanence or about no self, for instance. That if you think of those things as ultimate truths, then you're just drawing a new line between the permanent and the impermanent, for example, and saying, oh, everything's impermanent, and so the people who believe in permanence are wrong on the other side of the line. But that obscures what could be the practical purpose of recognising impermanence, that we need to adjust our tendencies. If we assume that everything's permanent, then obviously that's an absolutization, that's a limitation of our view. So the process and the practical activity of adjusting to the world around us and its conditions can be obscured by just taking it all as a set of beliefs that we ought to adopt, that are final beliefs. So divisions, dichotomies, dualities, that they are needed for specific purposes within particular contexts. You're going to catch a bus, you need to catch the bus, and either you catch it or you don't. But that's only within the framing of me wanting to catch the bus, having the goal of catching the bus. Once you pan out to a bigger framing, you might ask, well, why do you want to catch the bus? What's the point of that? It's got a bigger context. All the dichotomies we tend to rely on seem to depend on unquestioned context, and they're fine as long as we're able to question that context, but not if we're not. The so-called laws of logic and the excluded middle in Aristotelian logic. It's fine if you recognise that logic is just a tool that we use in particular circumstances. We make distinctions between things. Fine, we need to do that. I'm eating my breakfast. I need to distinguish between the food and what's not food. I'm not going to eat the plate. I'm making a binary distinction. Fine, but that doesn't mean final beliefs about the plate or about the food. It's just a response to the experiences I'm having and their practical application as I've learned them. So we apply logic, and again that's fine, but logic is not a key to the universe, and I just think it's a big distraction to interpret the practices involved in Buddhism as in terms of fancy logics. Really, it's not an alternative logic, it's a way of applying and interpreting logic. Okay, so that takes me really, basically I've talked about most of the key themes in that first section. Anything that's maybe a bit too compressed there, hopefully you can find opened out a bit more with more examples and explanation and so on in the book. But I hope that's provided some sort of helpful way in.